James Thompson wiped the morning frost from his hands as he stepped through the gates of the construction site. 20 years of building had left their mark on him. His fingers were calloused and scarred from countless projects across London. His back ached some mornings, but his spirit remained strong. Today felt different, though. Something in the air made him pause and look round the busy site. The new office complex rose like a giant skeleton against the grey London sky. Steel beams reached toward the clouds, and concrete mixers rumbled in the distance. James had worked on hundreds of buildings, but this one was special. It would house thousands of workers when finished. Families would depend on the job this building would create. James pulled his worn tool belt from his truck and fastened it round his waist. Each tool had a story. The hammer had built homes for young families. The level had ensured walls stood straight and true. The measuring tape had helped create spaces where children would play and dreams would grow. These tools were extensions of his hands, and his hands had built half of London. As he organized his equipment near the foundation, James noticed the other workers arriving. There was Robert, the crane operator who had 3 children and coached football on weekends. Margaret worked with electrical systems and was studying to become an engineer herself. Tommy was just 18, learning the trade and sending money home to his mother in Ireland. These were not just workers, they were people with dreams, families, and stories worth telling. The morning air carried the sounds of construction beginning. Machines hummed to life. Voices called out instructions, and the rhythm of building began. James loved this moment each day when potential became reality, when empty space transformed into something meaningful. A black car pulled up to the site entrance, and a young man stepped out. His suit was perfectly pressed, and his shoes shined like mirrors. This was clearly someone important, though James had never seen him before. The man carried a briefcase and walked with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. William Parker was 25 years old and fresh from university. His engineering degree hung on his apartment wall next to certificates of achievement. He had graduated at the top of his class and landed this job through family connections. Today was his first real day on an actual construction site, and he was determined to make an impression. William approached the work area where James was sorting materials. The older man was carefully checking each piece of equipment, making sure everything was safe and ready. His movements were precise and purposeful, showing years of experience. "Excuse me," William said, his voice carrying across the work area. Several nearby workers looked up from their tasks. "I need you to move those materials over there." He pointed to a spot 20 feet away, and tried to be careful. "This isn't like the simple jobs you're probably used to." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire. James felt them settle on his shoulders like a heavy coat. The other workers stopped what they were doing. Robert paused while adjusting his crane. Margaret looked up from her electrical plans. Tommy stopped mixing concrete and stared. They all knew something William did not know. They had worked with James for months on various projects. They knew his reputation, his skills, and his character. They had seen him solve problems that stumped engineers with fancy degrees. They had watched him treat every worker with respect, regardless of their job or background. But James simply nodded his head. "Of course, sir. I'll take care of it right away." He began moving the materials, each piece heavy and awkward. His back protested, but he worked steadily. William watched for a moment, then continued his inspection of the site. As he walked, he made comments loud enough for everyone to hear. "These manual laborers need constant supervision," he said to no one in particular. "They don't understand the complexity of modern construction. We have to spell everything out for them." Each word was like a small knife cutting into James's dignity. But he had learned something important over his 20 years of work. He had learned that other people's opinions could not change who he was inside. He had learned that responding to ignorance with anger only created more ignorance. The morning passed slowly. William continued giving orders and making comments about unskilled labor and simple workers. The other crew members grew increasingly uncomfortable. They wanted to speak up, to defend James. But they also knew he would not want them to fight. His battles. James worked through it all with quiet grace. He helped younger workers learn proper techniques. He solved small problems before they became big ones. He made sure everyone stayed safe. This was who he was, regardless of what anyone said about him. As the sun began to set over London, the workday came to an end. James packed his tools carefully, each one returning to its proper place. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new projects, and perhaps new lessons about human nature. He walked toward his truck, his weathered hands steady despite the day's humiliation. The other workers watched him go, their respect for him growing even stronger. They had witnessed something important today. They had seen how true strength sometimes means staying silent when others speak from ignorance. Sometimes the greatest strength is found in staying silent when others speak from ignorance. The evening light filtered through the small windows of James Thompson's flat as he sat in his favorite armchair. The day's work clothes hung neatly on a hook by the door, and his muddy boots waited by the entrance. The flat was modest but clean, filled with books about engineering and construction. On the mantelpiece sat photographs of buildings he had helped create over the years. But tonight, James's eyes were fixed on something special hanging on the wall above his small desk. In a simple black frame was his civil engineering degree from London University. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, but the words were still clear and proud. Bachelor of Civil Engineering, first-class honors, James Michael Thompson. Few people had ever seen this degree. James had learned over the years that showing it often created more problems than it solved. People expected engineers to wear suits and work in offices. They did not expect them to have calloused hands and mud on their boots. So James kept his qualification private, sharing it only with those who truly needed to know. The degree had not come easily. James remembered those long nights 25 years ago, studying by lamplight while his elderly mother slept in the next room. She had been sick for years, and James was her only family. While other students went to parties and enjoyed university life, James worked part-time jobs to pay for her medicine and the small flat. He would finish his construction job at 5 o'clock, rush home to cook dinner for his mother, help her with her evening routine, then study until midnight. His textbooks were covered with concrete dust and paint stains because he had to read them during lunch breaks at work sites. Other students had private tutors and expensive calculators. James had determination and a dream. His mother had been so proud the day he graduated. She was too sick to attend the ceremony. But James brought his degree home and showed it to her. She held it with shaking hands and smiled through her tears. 3 months later, she passed away peacefully in her sleep. James had kept the degree in the same frame ever since, a reminder of her sacrifice and his promise to make something of himself after graduation. James was excited to begin his career as a professional engineer. He applied to the biggest construction firms in London, confident that his excellent grades and work experience would open doors. He was young and hopeful, believing that hard work and talent were all that mattered. The first job came quickly. Pemberton and Associates was a respected firm that built office buildings and shopping centers. James arrived on his first day wearing his best suit, carrying a briefcase full of fresh notebooks and sharp pencils. He was ready to design buildings that would stand for generations, but the corporate world had different plans for James, despite his qualifications. He was assigned to basic tasks that any first-year student could handle. He watched his colleagues, with lesser grades and no construction experience, were given important projects. When James suggested improvements or offered solutions to problems, his ideas were often ignored or credited to others. Years passed, and James remained in junior positions while others advanced around him. He designed brilliant solutions that saved companies thousands of pounds, but the recognition always went to someone else. He worked longer hours than anyone, arrived early, stayed late, and never complained. Still, promotion remained out of reach. The final blow came 5 years ago while working for Mitchell Construction Group. James had spent months designing a complex foundation system for a difficult site with unstable soil. The project was challenging, requiring innovative engineering and careful calculations. James worked evenings and weekends, creating detailed plans that would ensure the building's safety for decades. When the project was completed successfully, the local engineering magazine wanted to write an article about the innovative design. James was excited to finally receive recognition for his work, but when the article appeared, it credited his supervisor, David Mitchell Jr., as the lead engineer. James's name appeared nowhere in the story. That night, James sat in the same chair where he now rested, staring at his degree and feeling completely defeated. He had given everything to the corporate world, and it had given him nothing in return. He was 45 years old, talented and experienced, but still treated like a beginner. But as he looked at his mother's photograph on the mantelpiece, James remembered her words from long ago. Sometimes, James, when the world won't make room for you, you have to make room for yourself. The next morning, James walked into Mitchell Construction Group and resigned. He used his life savings and took a small business loan to start Thompson Construction. The bank manager was skeptical about lending money to a man who wanted to leave a secure job. But James's engineering degree and work history convinced him. James began by hiring workers that other companies had overlooked. Robert, the crane operator, had been fired from his last job for being too old. Margaret, the electrician, had been told that construction was no place for women. Tommy, fresh from Ireland, could barely read but had magic in his hands when it came to concrete work. Together, they built more than buildings. They built a family of workers who treated each other with respect and dignity. Thompson Construction earned a reputation for quality work, fair wages, and honest dealing. James never forgot what it felt like to be overlooked and undervalued. Now, 5 years later, Thompson Construction was contracted for the same project where William Parker had dismissed James as just another laborer. The irony was not lost on James. Tomorrow, he would continue working alongside his crew, letting William believe what he wanted to believe. But when the time was right, James would teach an important lesson about respect and assumptions. James had learned that success without respect for others was hollow. He would teach this lesson when the time was right. Wednesday morning arrived with heavy grey clouds hanging over the London construction site. James Thompson noticed something wrong the moment he stepped out of his truck. The other workers were gathered in small groups, pointing and whispering. Their faces showed concern and worry. Something had happened overnight. James walked toward the main foundation area where most of the crew had gathered. What he saw made his stomach tighten with concern. Long, dead cracks ran through the concrete foundation like lightning bolts frozen in stone. The cracks were not small hairline marks that sometimes appeared in new concrete. These were serious breaks that went deep into the structure. Robert, The crane operator was the first to speak. "James, look at this mess. These cracks appeared sometime during the night. The whole foundation is shifting." Margaret, the electrician, shook her head as she examined the damage. "I've never seen anything like this before. The concrete was perfect. Yesterday afternoon when we finished work, Tommy, the young worker from Ireland, looked frightened. Does this mean we'll lose our jobs? Will the whole project be cancelled?" James knelt down beside the largest crack and ran his weathered fingers along its edge. The concrete felt solid in most places, but he could sense movement in others. His experienced hands told him what his eyes could see. The foundation was settling unevenly, putting stress on the entire structure. Within an hour, the site was buzzing with activity. William Park arrived in his black car, talking rapidly on his mobile phone. Behind him came a parade of expensive cars carrying engineers, supervisors, and consultants. Men in clean suits and shiny shoes walked carefully around the construction site, trying not to get mud on their polished appearances. William's face was pale with worry as he examined the foundation damage. This was his first major project, and everything was going wrong. He had spent sleepless nights studying the blueprints, making sure every detail was perfect. Now those same blueprints seemed useless against the reality of cracked concrete and shifting soil. "Get me the original soil surveys," William called out to his assistant. "And contact the geotechnical engineers who did the site analysis. There must be some mistake in their reports." 3 senior engineers from the main office arrived with briefcases full of documents and expensive testing equipment. They spread blueprints across folding tables and began measuring the cracks with precise instruments. Their conversations were filled with technical terms and worried whispers. Dr. Peterson, the chief consulting engineer, examined the damage with a serious expression. He was an older man with grey hair and thick glasses who had worked on major projects across Europe. His reputation was built on solving difficult engineering problems that stumped younger professionals. "This is quite serious," Dr. Peterson announced to the gathered management team. "The foundation is experiencing differential settling. The soil conditions are clearly different from what was indicated in the original surveys." William felt his heart sink as Dr. Peterson continued his assessment. "We'll need to excavate around the entire foundation, install additional support piles, and possibly rebuild sections of the concrete structure. The cost will be substantial, and the delay could extend the project timeline by 6 months or more." The project manager, Mr. Harrison, looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. 6 months. That will cost us hundreds of thousands of pounds in penalties and lost revenue. The client will never accept such a delay." As the consultants continued their discussions, James Thompson worked quietly nearby, while the engineers focused on their blueprints and calculations. James was studying the actual foundation with his experienced eyes and hands. He walked slowly around the entire structure, noting how the cracks followed certain patterns. James had seen similar problems before during his 20 years of construction work. Each project had taught him something new about how buildings interacted with the ground beneath them. Textbooks could explain the theory, but only hands-on experience could reveal the subtle signs that predicted structural problems. The soil beneath this foundation was different from what the surveys had indicated. James could tell either way. It felt under his boots and the smell of the earth when he dug small test holes with his hands. The original surveys had been done during a dry summer, but recent rains had revealed the true nature of the ground. There was more clay in the soil than expected, and clay behaved differently than sand or gravel. When it got wet, clay expanded and contracted, creating uneven pressure on foundation structures. The solution was not as complicated as the consultants believed. but it required understanding both engineering principles and practical construction techniques. James pulled a small notebook from his shirt pocket and began sketching diagrams and making calculations. His weathered hands moved quickly across the pages, drawing solutions that combined his engineering education with years of real-world experience. He had solved similar problems before, but always as an anonymous laborer whose ideas were credited to others. As panic spread through the management team, James continued his quiet analysis. The consultants were proposing expensive and time-consuming solutions because they were thinking like office engineers instead of practical builders. They wanted to completely rebuild what could be repaired and reinforced. James knew this was more than just a construction problem. This was a moment that would teach everyone an important lesson about respect, assumptions, and the value of experience. The young engineer who had dismissed him as an unskilled laborer was about to learn that wisdom came in many forms, the foundation of any project, whether it was a building or a relationship, must be built on solid ground. Thursday morning brought no relief to the troubled construction site. The grey London sky seemed to mirror the mood of everyone gathered round the cracked foundation. The expensive consultants who had arrived the day before stood in small groups, shaking their heads and speaking in hushed tones. Their confident expressions from yesterday had been replaced by looks of concern and confusion. Dr. Peterson, the chief consulting engineer, cleared his throat as he addressed the project manager and assembled team. His expensive suit was now wrinkled from a sleepless night spent reviewing calculations and blueprints. The thick glasses on his nose reflected the morning light as he delivered the news everyone feared. "I'm afraid the situation is more complex than we initially thought," Dr. Peterson announced, his voice heavy with disappointment. "The soil conditions are unlike anything in our database. The standard solutions we typically recommend simply won't work in this case." Mr. Harrison, the project manager, felt his stomach drop. "What exactly are you saying, Doctor?" "We're stumped," Dr. Peterson admitted, the words falling like stones into still water. "Without a viable solution, I'm afraid this project may need to be cancelled entirely. The risk is simply too great to continue." A murmur of fear rippled through the crowd of workers who had gathered to hear the news. Robert, the crane operator, thought about his 3 children and the football equipment he had promised to buy them. Margaret, the electrician, worried about her night school tuition that was due next month. Tommy, the young Irish worker, felt sick thinking about calling his mother to tell her he had lost another job. William Parker stood at the edge of the group, his face pale and drawn. At 25 years old, he was watching his promising career crumble before his eyes. The project that was supposed to launch him into engineering success was about to become his professional disaster. He had worked so hard to get this position, and now it seemed everything was falling apart. "There must be something we can do," William said desperately. "Maybe we could bring in specialists from Germany or America. Money isn't the issue here." Dr. Peterson shook his head slowly. "This isn't about money, young man. Sometimes engineering problems don't have textbook solutions. This appears to be one of those cases." As the consultants continued their gloomy discussion, James Thompson had been standing quietly at the back of the crowd. He had spent the entire previous evening in his small flat, working by lamplight just as he had done during his university days. His kitchen table was covered with hand-drawn diagrams, calculations, and sketches of possible solutions. James had seen problems like this before, though never quite so severe. His years of practical experience had taught him that soil was like a living thing. It moved and changed with weather, seasons, and time. The expensive computer models and laboratory tests could predict general behavior, but they often missed the subtle realities that only hands-on experience could reveal. The solution was not as complicated as the consultants believed, but it required thinking like both an engineer and a builder. It needed someone who understood the theory behind soil mechanics and the practical reality of working with clay and concrete and steel. James stepped forward through the crowd of worried workers and concerned managers. His work boots made soft sounds on the muddy ground as he approached the group of engineers and consultants. He had decided it was time to speak up, regardless of the consequences. "Excuse me," James said politely, his voice calm and steady despite the tension in the air. "I might have a solution." The conversation stopped as everyone turned to look at him. James stood there in his work clothes, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, facing a group of professionals in their expensive suits and polished shoes. William Parker was the first to respond, and his reaction was swift and dismissive. "I don't think we need construction advice right now," he said with a tone that carried both frustration and condescension. "This requires real engineering expertise, not manual labor suggestions." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Several of the workers shifted uncomfortably, knowing what William did not know. Margaret looked down at her feet. Robert clenched his fists. Tommy's face reddened with anger at the insult to the man who had been nothing but kind to Olive. Then James remained calm, his expression unchanged by William's rudeness. "Actually," he replied in the same steady voice, "I am an engineer. I'm also the owner of Thompson Construction, the company you hired for this project." The silence that followed was so complete that the sounds of distant traffic seemed loud. In comparison, Dr. Peterson's mouth fell open slightly. Mr. Harrison blinked in surprise. The other consultants looked at each other with confused expressions. William's face turned bright red as the full impact of James's words hit him. The man he had been dismissing and insulting for 3 days was not just any construction worker. He was a qualified engineer and the owner of the company contracted to build this project. James continued speaking, his voice remaining professional and calm. "The soil has a higher clay content than the original surveys indicated. The clay is expanding and contracting with moisture changes, creating uneven pressure on the foundation. We need to install additional micropiles at specific stress points and adjust the drainage system to control water flow around the structure." James reached into his jacket and pulled out several sheets of paper covered with detailed drawings and calculations. He had worked on these plans until 2 in the morning, using all of his engineering knowledge and construction experience to create a solution that was both practical and cost-effective. These micropiles will transfer the building's weight to stable soil layers below the problematic clay, James explained as he spread the plans on a nearby table. The improved drainage will prevent future water accumulation that causes the clay to expand. The entire solution will actually make the foundation stronger than the original design. Dr. Peterson examined the plans with growing amazement. The solution was elegant in its simplicity and brilliant in its practical application. It addressed the root causes of the problem rather than just treating the symptoms. Harrison looked up from the drawings with hope in his eyes for the first time in 2 days. "This is brilliant work, Mr. Thompson. How quickly can you implement the solution?" "2 days," James replied confidently. "My team is ready to begin immediately. We have the equipment and the expertise to complete the work quickly and safely." As James began organizing his workers and explaining the repair plan, William Parker stood in stunned silence. He watched the man he had treated so poorly take command of the situation with quiet confidence and professional skill. The realization of how badly he had misjudged James hit him like a physical blow. The foundation crisis was about to be solved. But William was just beginning to understand the deeper lessons about respect, assumptions, and the many forms that expertise could take. The morning sun broke through the London clouds as James Thompson's team began the foundation repair work. The construction site buzzed with purposeful activity as workers who had feared losing their jobs now moved with renewed energy and hope. James stood at the center of it all, directing the complex operation with the calm confidence of someone who had solved similar problems many times before. Robert operated his crane with precise movements, lowering the micropiles into position, exactly where James had marked on his detailed plans. Each pile had to be placed within inches of the specified location to ensure the building's weight would transfer properly to the stable soil layers below the problematic clay. Margaret worked alongside her electrical team, installing the new drainage pumps that would control water flow around the foundation. Her hands moved quickly and surely as she connected wires and tested systems. She had learned much about construction over the years, but watching James work taught her new things about how all the building systems worked together. Tommy mixed the special concrete that would secure the micropiles in place. The concrete had to be exactly the right consistency and strength to bond properly with both the steel piles and the existing foundation. James had taught him the precise mixture ratios, explaining how different weather conditions required small adjustments to achieve perfect results throughout the 2 days of repair work. James moved from one area to another, checking every detail and answering questions. His engineering knowledge guided the overall strategy, while his construction experience ensured that each step was completed safely and correctly. The other workers watched him with growing respect and admiration. Dr. Peterson and the other consultants observed the repair work with amazement. They had spent years studying soil mechanics and foundation engineering in universities and laboratories, but they had never seen theoretical knowledge applied so effectively in real-world conditions. James made the complex work appear simple and natural. William Parker watched from a distance, feeling increasingly uncomfortable as he witnessed James's skill and leadership. The man he had dismissed as an unskilled laborer was clearly one of the most knowledgeable engineers on the site. Every decision James made was based on deep understanding of both engineering principles and practical construction realities. By Thursday evening, the micropiles were in place and the new drainage system was functioning perfectly. The foundation cracks had been sealed with specialized materials that would flex with minor soil movements while maintaining structural integrity. James's solution was not only working, but it was making the foundation stronger than the original design had intended. On Friday afternoon, the final concrete pour was completed. The repair work that expensive consultants had said was impossible had been finished in exactly 2 days. As James had promised, the project was back on schedule, and dozens of workers would keep their jobs. More importantly, the building would now stand safely for generations. As the work crew began cleaning up their tools and equipment, William Parker gathered his courage and approached James. The young engineer had spent sleepless nights thinking about his behavior and the lessons he needed to learn. His expensive university education had taught him about mathematics and materials, but it had not taught him about respect and humility. "Mr. Thompson," William began, his voice shaking with nervousness and shame, "I owe you a sincere apology. I was completely wrong about you. My behavior was inexcusable." James looked at the young man with kind eyes that showed no anger or resentment. His weathered face reflected years of experience dealing with all kinds of people and situations. He had learned long ago that holding grudges only hurt the person carrying them. "We all make mistakes, William," James replied gently. "The question is what we learn from them." William felt tears forming in his eyes as he continued. "I've learned that respect should be given to everyone, regardless of their job or appearance. I judged you based on your work clothes and assumptions about construction workers. I was wrong about everything." He paused, struggling to find the right words for what he wanted to ask next. "Would you consider mentoring me? I clearly have a lot to learn about both engineering and leadership. My university degree taught me formulas and theories. But you understand how buildings really work." James smiled warmly, the same smile he had given to countless young workers over the years who had asked for guidance and training. "I'd be honored to help you grow, William. Real leadership isn't about putting others down. It's about lifting them up." In the months that followed, William became one of James's most dedicated students. He spent his evenings and weekends learning practical construction techniques alongside theoretical engineering principles. James taught him how to read soil conditions by touch and smell, how to predict structural problems before they became serious, and most importantly, how to treat every worker with dignity and respect. William learned that true strength comes from humility, and that wisdom can be found in the most unexpected places. The man in work boots and a hard hat often knew more about building than professors in university classrooms. Experience combined with education created the most effective kind of knowledge. 6 months later, when the office building project was completed successfully, James's company was awarded the contract for the next phase of development. The client had been impressed not only with the quality of the construction work, but with the way James had handled the foundation crisis with skill and professionalism. But for James, the greatest success was not the new contract or the recognition from industry professionals. His greatest achievement was helping transform a young man's perspective on respect and human dignity. William had grown from an arrogant graduate into a thoughtful leader who valued every person on his team. As James stood in his small flat that evening, looking at his engineering degree on the wall, he reflected on the real meaning of success. Sometimes the greatest buildings we construct are not made of steel and concrete, but of understanding and compassion. The end.